excited to talk to everybody about baby kelp, and let's go to the first slide. Before I really start talking about baby kelp and what it means to be, somebody who works with baby kelp on a regular basis, let's do a little bit of Kelp 101. So let's go to the next slide. This is going to be a question and answer session, so if you know the answer, feel free to shout it out. Question number 1, is kelp a plant? No. No is the answer. Next slide. So if we look at the evolutionary tree of life and when and where kelps are related to each other on the tree of life, we see that algae is actually pretty distant. So we have us up at the top, these are animals. A little bit further down the evolutionary tree is plants. Pretty close to plants, you can find green algae, but if we're thinking about kelp, other species of seaweed, they're even further down, so red algae down here and brown algae down here. So they're pretty distantly related from plants. So while we do refer to kelp a lot of times as a plant in the sea, it's actually technically not a plant. Next, question number 2. What is the difference between algae, seaweed, and kelp? All right, so let's pause right here. So if we can think of algae as a really big circle. So it's a big tub that encompasses a lot of things. And so what we can kind of see is that within that big circle of algae, we actually have 2 subcircles. So we have macroalgae and we have microalgae. So microalgae are all the things that you see, have to use a microscope to see. They're either unicellular or they only have a few cells. But then when we think about macroalgae, we're thinking about the stuff that we can see with our eyes. And macroalgae is essentially what we know of as seaweed. So what that tells us is that all seaweeds are algae, but not all algae are seaweeds. And so then within algae, we then also have a couple different categorizations. So on the previous evolutionary slide, we saw green algae, red algae, brown algae. Those are all different categorizations, but if you look within brown algae, we see an even smaller circle. And so click one more time. And so the difference there is that all kelps are seaweeds, but not all seaweeds are kelp. So that's the difference between algae, seaweeds, and kelps. It's a lot of interlocking circles. All right, what makes red, green, and brown algae different, other than their evolutionary history?
Their pigments.
I hear pigments from the back, and that is indeed correct. Next slide. So different pigments absorb different wavelengths of light. And so this over here, this graph kind of just shows how different pigments and where they fall along the wet light spectrum. And then this graph over here is kind of showing us that different types of algae, so green, brown, and red algae, they tend to absorb different wavelengths of light as well. And that's primarily because they're dominated by different pigments in their composition. Question number 4, do kelp have seeds? No. So we're going through the life cycle of kelp. So again, we have macroscopic and microscopic. So kelp has 2 different phases. It has a macroscopic stage, which is what we think of as the kelp, that's what we all see in the ocean when we're looking at seaweeds, but it also has a microscopic stage. So how we get to that is the adult kelp is called a sporophyte. It's diploid, which means it has 2 sets of chromosomes. We adult humans also have 2 sets of chromosomes. At maturity, the adult sporophyte is going to then produce this patch called a sorus, and that contains thousands of millions of little different spores. So at maturity, the sorus will release a bunch of different spores into the water, which will then eventually settle and become male and or female gametophytes. These gametophytes are haploid, which means they only have 1 set of chromosomes, kind of like an egg or a sperm cell. Once the male and female gametophytes are mature enough, the males will release sperm, which will fertilize eggs that the female gametophytes produce, and then they grow back up into little baby juveniles and become a large sporophyte. And all of this happens within a year. So a lot of times when we're talking about kelp and baby kelps, a lot of the times we're thinking about what's happening on the microscopic stage. But how does kelp farming work? Currently it's centered in a few different locations. So we have a lot of mariculture in Kodiak, we have some kelp farms in Homer, we have quite a few kelp farms in Cordova, which is where I'm based out of, and then we also have a bunch of kelp farms down in the southeast in Juneau, Sitka, and Ketchikan. Within all these kelp farms, there's a few main species that are being grown. So sugar kelp is the main species being grown. It's probably the majority of production, but 2 other main species that are becoming more and more commonly produced are ribbon kelp and bull kelp, and that's just kind of what they look like. Next slide. So we already went over the life cycle of kelp. So how does that translate to a kelp farm? Well, first, what happens is we will collect kelp from the wild, from beautiful kelp beds in nature. You can click. Once we collect the source that I was mentioning, we bring those back to the lab, and then we essentially take the spores that the source releases, and we put them on PVC spools that are wound with string. So then we try and grow those little baby gametophytes and baby sporophytes until they get big enough that they look ready to go out into the hatchery, or go out of the hatchery, and then farmers will then take those and put those out on the farm. And then after a couple months of growing on the farm, then they get harvested. So when does this all happen? So the kelp farming calendar, it kind of varies from region to region, but roughly around August, September, farmers are collecting source. They're bringing them to the hatchery. The hatchery season takes place, and then the kelp is then outplanted somewhere between October to December, but this can also go as late as February, depending on where you are and what species you're growing. Once you outplant it, the farming season is about 4 to 6 months, again, depending on when and how long you have to wait for the kelp to grow. And then generally harvest is taking place between April to June. So how does this work in a commercial hatchery? So in addition to being a postdoc and a researcher at the Prince William Science Center, I also run our commercial hatchery. So I'm the one who's in charge of growing all the little baby kelps that the farmers are taking. So what a commercial hatchery entails is, next slide, it entails a lot of temperature control. We have this giant walk-in incubator that we can set to whatever temperature we want. So we walk inside, it looks like this, and that's where we're growing all the spools. So temperature control is a really big part of the hatchery process. Additionally, we have a lot of water filtration. So while the Prince William Sound Science Center is located right next to the Prince William Sound, and we get our seawater from the bay, a lot of the seawater we're bringing in has a bunch of other stuff in it. It has sediment, it has little algae, it has phytoplankton, all this other stuff. So we run it through a excessive series of filters to try and get it as clean and as sterile as possible so that our kelp spools aren't going to grow anything gross that we don't want them to grow. And so there's a few other parts of the hatchery. The primary things we're focusing on, though, are temperature control. We're focusing on salinity, other abiotic conditions, but in 2025, how did this go? So this past year, we did pretty well. We produced 52,000 feet total of seed string for 3 different farms in Cordova. We grew about 45,000 feet of sugar kelp in 2 batches. We grew about 2,000 feet of bull kelp, 2,400 feet of ribbon kelp, and then another 2,000 feet of giant kelp, which is the first time for us. And a lot of our spools were really high quality. If you look at the worst spool on our left, there's some weird little white patches. The coverage isn't great, but overall, the color looks really good. The kelp looks really healthy. It looks really great, and so a lot of the farmers were pretty happy this past year. 2025 successes. We produced great kelp and happy farmers. So some of the things I was pointing out earlier, the water filtration, the temperatures, those were major infrastructure upgrades we made within the past year. Those really paid off. All our abiotic variables were very constant. The pH was increasing over the course of the season, but that happens because kelps photosynthesize more the older they get. And our water filtration system was great. We had very little contamination, so the only thing we were really seeing growing on our spools was kelp, which is exactly what we want. And yeah, we just learned a lot this year, and it was a great time, and it was my first time running a commercial hatchery, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And so continuing into the future, we will be growing kelp for hopefully many, many more seasons. It's a lot of labor, so we're hoping to hire a technician for future. We're formalizing some of our business practices, and we're working to better understand kelp species not commercially cultivated, and still trialing a bunch of other seeding techniques as well. But you can already see, these are pictures I got from some of the farmers who outplanted our kelp just 2 months ago. They started from those really little baby things that I showed you, and they're already looking nice and big, and hopefully in a few months, they're gonna be this big. So it's very exciting.